Good. So I'm going to show you quite quickly quite a lot of images, and it's based on work I've been doing with somebody called Katrine Bone for quite a few years now, looking at the idea of how to integrate what we call productive landscapes into cities. So I'm going to start with some drawings of early studies that we did, beginning to kind of ask this question about whether you could fit urban agriculture into cities. That was one strand of the work. Another strand of the work was looking at quantifiable aspects of food yields, et cetera. But probably the main thing was to try and see whether there would be qualitative benefits as well as quantifiable benefits to doing this within a city. So this is an early drawing from, I think it's about 1998, where I just took a map of London. And at that point, London had a population of 7 million, and took a conservative figure, which would be 100 square meters of space per person, worked out how big that was in square meters, and then just cut London up and inserted these strips, which would represent the amount of land required for growing. And this drawing was important for us in a number of ways, because one, it indicated to us that actually the city wouldn't need to expand enormously to accommodate food production. It wasn't like you needed a place 6 times as big as London. And the other thing was, if you took seriously these stripes of agricultural land and just imagined them running through London, you started realizing that this city would have a completely different character, but it would be a very kind of interesting, fascinating character. So we then did a series of other studies, also thinking often about this problem of if you introduce urban agriculture into city, how do you stop it becoming a suburb? So in other words, how do you keep the kind of urbanity in the city? And one space that captures this sense of being urban, but also having a sort of a sense of being able to breathe within it, actually is Central Park within New York. And there's something about the dimension of that which doesn't stop the city being urban, but gives this kind of sense of openness within the city. And so this little study, which is sort of like an extreme kind of mapping of what a city would be like if you took the proportions of Central Park within Manhattan and just repeated it, give an idea of the kind of arrangements that might retain urbanity while giving space for production, was one study. This is another one doing the same, but this time into Dublin, using the Dublin municipal plan. And just playing around with these started giving ideas about the sort of spatial models that could work. And that then led us to proposing this design concept called the continuous productive urban landscape, which is trying to find ways of introducing pockets of productive space into cities, but giving coherence to these spaces. So you don't just get what seem to be like a lot of little leftover pocket parks, but you start creating a kind of coherent network within the city. So this was a major part of our work, and has continued to be. And that then runs into then looking at how you would kind of introduce these spaces into a city. And one of the things, of course, that's been mentioned several times already, is that every city is unique. And wherever you look, you find different ways and different opportunities for kind of introducing these kind of networks into cities. And obviously, in the center of a very dense city, there's less space than on the outskirts. But we've used architectural competitions as a kind of vehicle for testing these ideas, because they come with constraints, and then you can try and design around those. So one part of this work was looking at, as I say, the kind of spatial possibilities, thinking about qualities, which I'm not really going to talk about now. And then the other part was looking at yields. And I mean, we're architects, so we were gathering this information from sources which weren't that readily available at the time this work was being done. But one of the questions was, you know, what kind of yields could you expect from different kinds of development? So using these architectural competitions we worked on, we would integrate productive spaces, and then we sort of measured these against the density of inhabitation and come to the conclusion that probably the kind of target for a city is something like 20%, 15% of fruit and vegetable production from urban agriculture, if you maintain the normal kind of urban qualities we're used to. And that, as a contribution, is quite significant, because if you look at, for example, most work on low energy buildings, making like 15% reductions in energy consumption due to having daylighting would be considered quite significant. So it seemed to us this was kind of on a par with all the other aspects of sustainability that we'd be looking at. Then the question was typologies. And this, I suppose, kind of iconic image is from a study we did in Cuba, where we've done a few visits, to understand how the urban agriculture spaces work. The thing about Cuba that's interesting is that the spaces were put in very pragmatically. They weren't designed. So it is a real kind of laboratory where you can look at a space, understand how it works, and understand its potentialities for a more kind of careful and considered placing within an urban strategy. I think one of the things that surprised us was in a recent piece of work where we've been looking at what's happening, instead of going to Cuba, it was going to the United States, because there was so much happening there. And the prevalence of rooftop farms. When we started the work, we kind of almost ignored rooftop farms because we assumed that they would be like too difficult. Why would you build a farm on a roof if you could build it in the ground? But actually that's where a lot of these initiatives have taken off. And they have an amazing quality about them, which is probably best summed up by Alder van Eyck, who an old Dutch architect, who would talk about right size. That, like in architecture, when you get it right, it has something called right size, which doesn't necessarily have meters attached to it. But these spaces have that amazing kind of quality attached to them, which kind of invite inhabitation apart from being spaces that are productive. Of course, the other type that's been discussed is the more commercially oriented rooftop farm, which works with low weights, etc., hydroponics, retrofitted into cities. And then, you know, the other part that people are experimenting with, of course, is aquaponics. This picture is from an amazing project that doesn't exist anymore, which was in Milwaukee, called Sweetwater Organics, which was set up, again, by people who knew nothing about farming, but had worked with Will Allen, who has this huge project also in Milwaukee. And they described this space as a kind of a laboratory, a museum, a farm, and it became a real kind of social hub as well as a productive hub for various technical reasons to do with, for example, partly the building it was in. It didn't work because it didn't have enough daylight, the building wasn't heated. But it's one of these new kinds of spaces that one could imagine emerging in a city with productive landscapes. And of course, we've touched on this as well before, that there are different types of space. I mean, there's a personal and seasonal landscape, which is more kind of socially directed, and then there's a more productively driven landscapes. So overall, what we're talking about is this idea of productive landscape, and what's interesting about it is that it operates at so many different scales. So it operates at the scale of the city, the region, the building, and then the interior space within a building. And that's one of the things that makes it fascinating to try and design with. So all this work we've tried to consolidate into two books, which the first one was published in 2005, and the second one has just come out now. But the transition between those two periods was remarkable. So when the first book came out, the subject was seen, at least in the architectural field, as really eccentric, and people thought you were only talking about allotments. Whereas now, when you discuss this topic, it's very well understood. But one of the things I wanted to say about this work, is that better? Okay, is that this transition from something which was seen as really kind of eccentric and on the fringe to something which now everybody knows what you're talking about was made with a lot of input from artists, designers, and writers. It wasn't farmers who made the transition. Well, I qualify that. I mean, in terms of development work and in terms of food being grown out of necessity, it was farmers. And probably one of the most important organizations in that whole movement is the Dutch organization called RUAF, who've led a huge amount of amazing work. But otherwise, a lot of the work came about through exhibitions, through interventions, to kind of one-off demonstrations, which actually got the idea into the public realm. And that's also what kind of enabled people to take these ideas on who weren't originally from the field. And just at the moment, that kind of movement continues, often in a slightly unexpected way. This image is of the latest installation in Tate Modern by an artist, and he has taken soil from London. Each of these trays has soil from a different part of London, and what you realize is it has a different color when you put it together like this. When we did the project in Cuba, we also worked with an English artist called Tom Phillips, and he collected soil from different sites and he made paintings with them. But anyway, this idea of these kind of qualitative benefits and of what these spaces mean when you observe the city and when you're in the city are very, very important. And it, of course, is very hard to argue for making space available that has these kind of qualitative benefits when you're arguing with somebody who only looks at the profitability of building a hotel or something on a piece of land. But these pieces of work, as for example does the High Line in New York, are very important in kind of changing people's perceptions about what a productive space would be like in a city. So the point was, artists, designers, people who you wouldn't think about being involved with farming had a very, very big role in this work. Whoops. And of course, it's very complex. So here we've tried to map out the kind of different dimensions related to an urban food system, and then try to use this diagram to kind of work out where you sit in that. Because at least up until now, when the project's been emerging, you felt you had to try and cover everything. And of course, it's very difficult to. But actually understanding kind of where your piece of work slots into this picture is important. Another thing I'd like to reiterate that came up earlier was the issue of biodiversity and productive landscapes. And this 2010 report by the UN Institute of Advanced Studies talking about urban biodiversity explicitly refers, in this case, to the sepal concept as being a kind of a model for introducing these spaces, along with a very nice idea about sustainable systems working with unlikely partners. That a resilient, sustainable system is one where you have unlikely partners coming together. And these are ideas that lots of people can work with, especially, I think, architects and urban designers. And then in Detroit, of course, which is very famous for the depopulation of the city, in the plan which has been put forward to try and redevelop the city, they state explicitly that productive landscapes should be put at the heart of a sustainable city. So thinking about all these things, we then try to put together a kind of a work plan, an action plan for how you go about moving from the kind of theory into the practice. And we talk about 4 steps that really should happen simultaneously in a project. So one is top-down and bottom-up integration. The other, which is very important, is visualization. So both visualizing what spaces look like, but also visualizing how they would work, who the players would be, who would have to interact, what it would mean for our daily life and routine. Third one, again, very important, inventories of urban capacity, because in the early studies, people would look at how much land was available. But of course, land on its own doesn't mean anything, or isn't enough, isn't sufficient. And so it has to be the land and the players and who the farmer will be and who will do the marketing and who will buy the produce and where will the water come from. So actually beginning to kind of map out all of these capacities before you can develop a strategy. And then obviously, once you try these things out, they usually don't work the way you think you're going to. So the continual kind of iterations of research. And then we use these kind of categories to map out where we think different projects we're working on fit. Can I just ask you how much time is left?
12 minutes exactly, if you don't want any questions.
All right, okay. So maybe we won't have questions.
Just write
okay.
and within 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, that'll be difficult. So what I wanted to show was sort of 2 examples of kinds of work. So the first examples are these ones which are the ones we've been involved with up until now, which are more kind of demonstration installations. And I think these are important because they've had a big impact in kind of changing thinking. So this is one in a place called Middlesbrough, which could be the Detroit of the UK, you could say, where a project was set up with the residents in the city over a 2-year period, looking at how food growing could come into it. And it resulted in the city actually adopting public space and growing food in it. Of course, what everyone found was that when you grew the food in the middle of the city, vandalism and the general kind of destruction of it was pretty well non-existent, actually. I mean, in the same way probably that when you grow flowers in a garden, people in a city, people don't destroy them. But anyway, that project has had a legacy which has been more in the sort of public health realm and opening up allotments than in the introduction of a major new green infrastructure in the city. Other kinds of work like this included this one right in the center of London, behind the British Museum, where as part of something called the London Festival of Architecture, we set up an event called the Continuous Picnic, which involved people bringing food in which was grown, but more importantly, people utilizing space in a public way. This idea about how you create the desire for creating sort of convivial spaces in the city, which is part of what these networks of productive landscapes could do. And then smaller projects doing little prototypes as part of exhibitions, looking at, for example, hydroponic systems integrated into buildings, or like somebody was in the presentation talking about Germany, talking about people growing food on balconies. And this is an idea of how you could actually design a balcony to accommodate food growing and provide degrees of screening and privacy, etc. And then we'll pick up, this is another project which was referred to earlier, which is the Anfelt project in Cologne, which was, again, an area of the city which sort of post-industrial area, and working with residents, and again with artists, a landscape architect, Katrine Bone, who's an architect, working with residents to come up with a strategy for what they call the low line, which was also working with an old railway line, to connect up and create a series of productive landscapes. And as part of that process, a community garden was set up, working with a local housing association who were building housing. And this garden, which had fruit trees, as sites would be developed in the future, the garden would kind of move, and some of the plants would remain on the site as housing was built around it, as orchards, and then the garden would move to next sites that would be built in the future. But this is an ongoing project, and the idea is to see whether this kind of infrastructure can be created. So those are some of the projects we've been working on up until now. At the moment, what we're doing is looking at are there ways that practitioners can kind of find pathways to policy, like policy that would support these projects. And so this is a network which we're running, and it includes some very interesting projects. So this is one which you might all know, which is on the edge of Paris in Cologne. It's called Urbaine, and it's run by somebody called Doina Petrescu as an EU kind of demonstration project. It includes food growing spaces. It includes a kind of a market community building at the back, plus there's a separate site which has a recycling center. There's a kind of mobile information center, and there's plan for housing. But this is one of the most animated landscapes you can find if you go to visit it. If you visit it when it's in use, it's full of people, it's very active, it has a huge kind of social benefit. It's a temporary project, and at the moment, my understanding is that the mayor in the area has just changed. Her husband owns the land, and he's a developer, and he wants to turn it into a car park. So there's a bit of a protest going on at the moment about what should happen to it, though it was always designed as a temporary space. Another very interesting project, which is on the edge of Geneva, which is the first consciously designed productive park that we're aware of.
It's
one
almost
in a competition.
over. Huh? It's almost over.
It's almost over. Okay.
You have 1 or 2 minutes. A conclusion. I mean.
Conclusion.
Well, I don't know how long you have.
What do I want to conclude with is that these projects are happening, and the issue really is how we translate them into projects that are less about one-off and are more about just creating part of an essential infrastructure in cities. And the reason I asked the question about Paris was that it does seem to me that of all the cities in Europe, this is the one example that I'm aware of where there is a conscious effort to try and curate, bring together the players, do the research, find out what spaces are available in order to kind of create more productive landscapes in the cities. I think that's a very interesting one. In terms of our own work, this is just about mapping policy, but where we are now is beginning to see if you can set up a project with Letchworth, which is the first garden city that was built in the UK on the principles of Howard, and look effectively at a way of kind of retrofitting Letchworth with productive landscapes. And that might be an interesting sort of way in to see how these landscapes contribute to a city.
Thank you, André. Merci.